PanPastel has evolved into a standalone and self-sustaining medium. It offers smooth transitions of color variances, especially when the applicator is double loaded with 2 or 3 colors. We artists like to expand and look for alternate ways to express ourselves. The question is, can PanPastel be used in a mixed medium application? The answer is yes. Besides adding regular stick pastels for texture, PanPastel is quite compatible with watercolor. The diverse pigments used in all mediums are the same. The only difference is the binder that hosts the powdery pigment. For example, burnt sienna is the same ground dust that comes from mineral ores. In oils, they normally add linseed oil. In case of watercolor, they use gum arabic. When watercolor dries, you have a matte finishing. This is when you can apply PanPastel. The direct usefulness of this is where areas in your watercolor end up being overworked. This happens when layers of paint get added on top of each other. This can easily result into a scabby effect. All watercolor artists are aware of this problem. This is when PanPastel can freshen up overworked areas and enliven dull areas. As you can see, when this is applied to a dry watercolor, it is hard to tell the difference between the two mediums, if at all, much less once the painting is framed. As mentioned earlier, that's because the watercolor binder has dried. PanPastel is spread thinly into the grooves of the watercolor paper with the applicators, so it looks the same as dried watercolor. When I did this wall originally in watercolor, the paint didn't run correctly the way I wanted it to, and the wall ended up looking somewhat overworked with uneven patches of light and darkness. So I decided to unify all that using PanPastel. Presto! Now it looks cleaner. I noticed the plant looked too pruned, so I decided to add more leaves. Not only can you scumble on top of a watercolor, but you can paint on it. This way you have perfect control. If you don't like what you just did, you can erase it off and start over until you get it right. Notice how I'm adding to the background. You cannot tell it was originally done in watercolor. PanPastel can create the same wet-on-wet effect by blending it into the paper as if it were watercolor. Another neat thing that you can do is scumble over areas to push them back to justify the atmosphere perspective. I am scumbling some blue sky color on the trees, and you can see how that tree limb goes further back into the distance. I forgot to reserve the white paper for highlights, so you can see I am resorting to PanPastel to cover up the darks. I chose a pigment that has more tinting power. The more tinting power the pigment has, the better it will cover the underlayer of your watercolor. On this tree on the left, I felt that the brown paint infiltrated too much in my green mixture and it looked somewhat dirty. See how you can easily override this? Once again, PanPastel does a good makeup job on watercolor areas you don't like. Another fantastic application with PanPastels over watercolor, you can create a very convincing feeling of fog or mist. Apply titanium white with the sponge applicator in circular motions as if you were waxing a car. How about some sun rays peeking through the clouds? Titanium white is not 100% opaque in PanPastel. Because it's semi-transparent, PanPastel creates these wonderful effects in the sky. You want to paint right over the PanPastel with watercolor? No problem. You can paint right on top.